And we're back. Again, this is the Catholic Lady, and we're reading Great Lion of God by Taylor Caldwell. We are on chapter 16, and this is part 3. They drove away in the cauldron of yellow light, which was now full morning, and the heat beat at them like heated rods through their garments. Saul was not a stranger to deserts and lifeless places, but now, as the wheels turned rapidly farther in the direction of Damascus, he was stunned, not only by the heat, but by the complete and barren desolation which lay all about him, empty of all life, even the most hardy, except for thistles, treeless, raging with incredible and blinding light, the hills beyond a pure stony brass, the ground below saffron and thick with dust, and boulders and gravel, and flat as a man's palm. The sky a stark and staring blue, too intense for more than a quick glance, and cloudless, the sun an enormous hole of flame approaching the zenith, and here and there, where little spring rills had run, straggles of dry amber crawling over the stricken earth. Vultures, black and silent, and sharp as ink, soared against the sky, seeking and bending and wheeling. Occasionally, scattered caves appeared, trembling in waves of heat, their openings like great dry mouths, dead of thirst and gaping. There was no waterhole visible anywhere, no green oasis in this landscape of Gehenna. Once Saul thought he saw the lurking shape of a jackal casting a clear shadow on the parched and blighted ground, but as jackals were the color of the landscape itself, it was impossible to be certain. Saul had often pondered on the thought that he would like to retreat to the desert for a space, to this immense and lifeless silence, this incandescent light. But as he looked about him now, he confessed that he could not understand why even the most dedicated and fervid Essene or zealot should choose to place a place which could only resemble hell. It was said that these men could find locust and wild honey when necessary, and water, but Saul saw no spot where these could be obtained. They were far from the city, and yet they penetrated more and more into the wilderness. And Saul guessed, by the sureness of the Nubians' driving of the black stallions, that this was no new territory to him, and that he was familiar with it. His massive earrings cast golden shadows on his polished ebony cheeks, and he was gazing about him with indifferent pride. Saul began to be more than grateful for the umbrella raised over his and Joseph's head by the servant who sat between them. Joseph lifted his hand and pointed toward the hills, and Saul saw below them, dancing in heat waves, a cluster of low caves, just beginning to climb the lower flank of the nearest hill. "Our destination," said Joseph. In that air, as clear as molten glass, the caves appeared to be much nearer than they truly were, and Saul was beginning to suffer from heat and thirst long before the yellowish stone of the caves reluctantly approached them across the barrens. Suddenly the tiny figure of a man appeared on the top of the lowest cave or cavern, and he seemed as black and intensely sharp as the vulture against the sky. He waved an infinitesimal hand in greeting, and then stood there, a wild and bearded little figure, watching them. After a while he was joined by similar figures, and there was a shagginess about them which suggested fur garments about their loins. They wore no cloaks, nor hoods to shelter them from the sun and the heat, and as the car raced closer to the caves, Saul could see their faces almost as black as the Nubians, and thick with beards. Their arms and hands and legs were dark and thin but muscular, and now they leaped as lightly as goats to the ground, and their voices could be heard vivid yet fragile as flutes. "Shalom, shalom." Joseph was smiling in the shadow of his hood. He made a trumpet of his hands and called a greeting in return to those who awaited him. They were growing in number. Now there were at least 50, then more, and then more than 100. They seemed to leap, not only from the caves, but from the earth itself, and the sun struck gleams from their eyes and from their teeth, and from their actions and their gestures and their movements. Saul could see that they were young, and that some were hardly more than boys, who had just reached their youth. For these had small or no beards. He felt his own sweating chin. He bore no beard himself, for his skin was so fair that a beard irritated it beyond sufferance, and induced sores. And Rabban Gamaliel had said, God desires us to love and to serve him, but not to endure unnecessary pain in that service. For that is vainglorious. And did not Lucian, the Greek, say that if beards were necessary for wisdom, a goat would be a veritable Plato? Some of the younger of the desert dwellers could not restrain their joy and enthusiasm at seeing their friend Joseph of Arimathea, and came running toward the car, racing fiery clouds of yellow dust in their wake. Saul glanced at the provisions Joseph had brought: leather bottles of wine, wheels of cheese, wheaten and oaten bread, fruit and vessels of artichokes and vinegar and garlic, and kegs of beer and closely wrapped bottles of sound Syrian whiskey. There were baskets of onions also, and citrons, very pungent in the heat, and heaps of dates and figs, and boxes of pastries, and jars of rendered fat and dried meats. There were small leather pouches which Saul more than suspected contained respectable amounts of Roman gold sesterces and drachmas. There were also many books tied with rope, and blankets, and pottery, and cutlery. In truth, the huge car was so provisioned that there was barely room for the 4 riders in it. The young men had now reached the car and were shouting and laughing and calling like children, and grinning at Joseph and casting curious looks at Saul. They leaped and they danced and clapped their hands, and Saul, who had expected gloomy recluses with stern and remote faces, thought that he had never seen so merry a gathering and so joyous. They shouted inquiries of Joseph. They asked of his family and his and their friends. They uttered laughing oaths at the mention of the priest of the temple. Some, in their exuberance, engaged in a little running wrestling matches. Their feet were bare and sinewy and almost black, where at the most they wore rope sandals. They might be as lean as bone and their flesh like hard strings and sinews, but their eyes shone with clear delight in living and glowing passion. The Nubian watched all this with the indulgence of a man several years older than these dark and dusty youths, and even deigned to smile occasionally, and flicked elegantly at his silken turban of many colors, and shrugged his golden necklace about his long serpentine neck. He was a barbarian emperor in the midst of his wild and almost naked servants, and he bestowed a very white smile upon them, and urged them to watch the horses' hoofs, which only made them dance the merrier into dangerous proximity. The air was clamorous with their young voices. They sang. They guided the Nubian to a place behind the nearest caves, and here, to Saul's amazement, the shadow cast by the caves was almost cool and purplish, and in its midst was a bubbling spring. He thought, the shadow of a great rock in a weary land, and understood completely, for the first time, the meaning of the phrase in the Scriptures. Now a man rounded the side of the sheltering cave, an older man of some 30 years, broad of shoulder, tall, and incredibly emaciated, but giving the impression of immense vitality and indomitable strength and authority. His beard was black and thick and curly, his nose sharply and thinly beaked and predatory, his mouth faintly smiling, his black eyes large, shining under shaggy black brows. When the youth saw him, they fell back in respect, and he held up his arms to Joseph and almost lifted him from the car. The two then embraced and kissed each other. Joseph, as usual, was finely clad. But the man he held so tenderly was nearly nude, with a goat's skin about his loins, and his burned skin glistened with sweat. They held each other off and gazed into each other's eyes and smiled, and embraced again, and murmured the holiest of greetings, concluding with a passionate, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Then, holding his friend's hand tightly, Joseph turned to Saul, who had stiffly alighted from the car, and had thrown back his hood to catch the coolness of this place. "Jochanan, my brother, my friend, I have brought him of whom I have written, Saul of Tarshish, who chooses, like us, rather to obey God than man, and to serve him." Saul looked directly into the countenance of Jochanan. He had been greeted as a brother of Joseph of Arimathea, and as the dearest of friends, and he discerned with a kind of shrinking awe the pure and terrible holiness of those great black eyes, which seemed to force their gaze into his heart, to discover all that lay there, and to pass inexorable judgment. It was like facing the blaze of the sun, from which nothing can escape. Saul felt himself mute and small and miserable, and uncomely and without significance, and an intruder. And then Jochanan set his long hands on Saul's shoulders and smiled down at him with a fearful scrutiny. And then his brows drew together, then relaxed, and he said in a most gentle, almost compassionate voice, "Shalom, greetings to the friend of my friend, Joseph of Arimathea, and may our Father, blessed be his name, grant to you all that he desires to grant. Welcome, Saul of Tarshish." As if some intense moment and climactic had arrived, and then had passed in safety and peace, the youths, at a distance, raised a happy cry of jubilation, and Joseph smiled as though in relief. And Saul, who was bemused and bewildered, felt a loosening in him, and the banishment of the fear he had momentarily experienced, and which could not be explained. Some of the younger and chattering boys were capering away with the provisions which they carried to the cave, where they stored their few goods and their meager possessions. Jochanan put one arm about Saul's shoulders and the other about Joseph's, and led them to another cave where the dimness was welcome after the conflagration outside, and where there was coolness in the earth, where breathing, though through some crevice. In truth, Saul felt the light, chill breath, and sighed some pleasure. The cave was large, and furnished with a pallet on the earthen floor, a low wooden table, and 2 benches. The floor bore scattered black and white hides of goats, and in one corner was a heap of scrolls. There was nothing else. The 2 guests sat down, and Jochanan said, and Saul heard the deep and rapid timbre of his manly voice, "Thanks to you again, Joseph. We shall have a feast." "You have but to say the word, Jochanan, and every 7 days such feast will arrive without fail." Jochanan shook his powerful head, but he smiled. "My young friends would then grow fat and long for the flesh pots, and there would be few else to praise his name and keep pure his commandments, and speak of the Messiah." His mighty knees gleamed darkly in the spectral light of the cave, and his chest was like leather armor, and black with thick hair. He looked with kindness at Saul and said, "Though you do not know me, I know you, Saul of Tarshish." He paused. "Joseph has written often of you." But Saul felt that he was speaking with constraint, and not saying all he could say. 2 youths were with lively faces, brought in plain pottery plates, and a platter heaped with cheese and bread and fruit, and meat which Joseph had brought, and earthen goblets foaming with beer, and a bottle of wine. Saul discovered that he was hungry, but Jochanan ate sparely, as did Joseph, and the 2 friends spoke together in quiet, grave voices of things mysterious to Saul. Nevertheless, they were words of import. I leave before the full moon, said Jochanaan. Therefore we do not meet again, Joseph, for some time. You have received the summons? True. Even in the dimness Saul could see the sudden sadness of Joseph's face. He heard him sigh. The drama then begins, said Joseph, and he clasped his hands together on the table and contemplated them. And never ends, said Jochanaan. Come, dear friend, would you have it otherwise? Joseph was silent for a space. Finally he spoke, still contemplating his hands. We cannot avoid, even by prayer, what has been ordained from eternity. Of a certainty, we would rejoice that we have been permitted to know this hour. Still, as a mortal man, I am filled with sorrow and with pain. I would die 1,000 times, 10,000 times over, to spare him one pang. I would lay my body before his feet for the trampling, and call myself blessed. I would be flayed alive for his sake, and rejoice. But that is not my destiny. Jochanaan touched and clasped hands quickly. No, it is not your destiny. You have another, but rejoice with me that I have finally received summons and must go. Excuse me, my cold. I'm trying to get these at least to 20 minutes to make it a little easier. To Saul's amazement, Joseph's eyes filled with tears, and he bowed his head. Oh, of what man were they speaking? What prophet unknown to him? What holy man? If they knew of such, why was not he, Saul, ben Hillel, permitted to sit at his feet? As if Joseph had heard these questions, he lifted his bent head and strove to smile at Saul. Forgive us that we are seemingly speaking riddles, my Saul. We cannot tell you as yet, but in his time God will enlighten you. That Jochanaan has told me. Saul's red brows drew together, and he could not refrain from saying, We have met but today. He knows me not. Ah, said Jochanaan, God blessed be his name, has told me many things. Do not be impatient, my son. His puissant face darkened for a moment. How will he call you, I do not know, though I know he will. Do not turn aside when you hear his voice. Saul frowned. He felt himself diminished to the state of a schoolboy, for all he was 25 years of age, and this wild man with the rude accent of the province of Galilee was hardly more than 5 years older. He said, I am not without friends. My cousin's husband is the Roman officer Aulus Platonius, and his son is Titus Milo, a praetorian captain in Rome. And I am a Roman citizen versed in Roman law, and my grandfather is the friend of Herod Antipas and Pontius Pilate. And if there is some Jew who is in danger or pursued or under sentence of death, it is possible that I could plead for him. He had no sooner said these words than he colored with shame of himself, though his boasting had been innocent, and he had felt himself offended. The older men regarded him gently, and then Jochanaan said, There is none who can save him, for he has chosen this for himself. Saul remembered how Joseph of Arimathea had saved many from the dreadful death on the cross nearly 10 years before, and had preserved others from suffering. So his harsh anger at both himself and the others disappeared, but it was replaced by discomfiture. He drank more wine. Suddenly he remembered the dream of the nameless peasant who had perished on the cross also, and whose dying body had become encased as if in the shell of a seed, and had dropped into the earth, and had given birth to a limitless harvest. Saul's face changed. Yes, said Jochanaan, in a quick and urgent voice. Saul stared at him in open surprise. I was but remembering a dream, he said. It was a dream that preceded an almost mortal illness of mine, and which left me with this half-closed and sunken eye. Tell me, said Jochanaan. Saul told himself that this was absurd. Why should Jochanaan, and Joseph also, be so intent on him now, demanding that he speak of a dream he had had so long ago? and which was only the precursor of a fever, or the result of it. He smiled in embarrassment, but the two men kept their gaze upon him, commanding. Therefore he told them, watching for amused smiles, for the shrugs, for answering embarrassment, even for a laugh. But their faces became more intent and grave, and they began to exchange glances and leaned closer to him, and they seemed hardly to breathe. I was sickening, said Saul. I had seen the execution of 50 young Jews by the Romans. There was death and agony in my heart. I was also chilled by the storm and wetted by the rain that followed. I could not free myself from the memory of the poor working man, though he was none of importance, who had walked among the crosses and had appeared to lighten the suffering of the dying. Joseph saw him also. He glanced at Joseph, who nodded speechlessly. Saul continued, I had seen him once before, during the high holy days, with one he addressed as his mother. She called him Yeshua. His face haunted me. I do not know why. He was poor and humble. Why should I dream that he too had been executed and fallen into the earth? Saul became silent. There was silence all about him. He looked up to see the moved faces of the older men, and now even Jochanan's eyes were wet with tears. Joseph made an impulsive gesture, but Jochanan laid his hand on his wrist as if in warning. It was but a dream, said Saul in a lame voice, and he was ashamed again that he had been indiscreet. All life is but a dreaming, though a frightful one, said Jochanan. But one day you will understand the significance of that dream, my Saul. Come, the sun is declining, and you must soon leave. And I wish to speak to my boys, for soon I too must go. They went outside. The sun was falling to the west, and though the earth and the mountains still glowed as if from a furnace, the air was slightly cooler. The youths had gathered together, crouching on the ground, sitting, squatting, and waiting for Jochanan. Jochanan, with the dignity of a king, climbed the top of one cave, and then another, until he stood above them like a dark statue, imbued with wildness and authority, and all faces were turned to him. His voice sounded like them, among them like a gigantic trumpet. I go because I have been summoned, and the hour is come. I go to prepare the way. This you know, this you have been told, my children, my little ones. I go with rejoicing and in triumph. You must not grieve that I leave you, for you will see me again. I ask but your prayers. I ask but that you wait, for the last hour draws near. He looked down at those silent faces, and his own great one became tender, as the face of a father is tender, and he spoke in the words of Isaiah. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwell in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shined. For the yoke of his burden, and the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, God has broken as on the day of Midian. For every boot of the tramping warrior in battle tumult, and every garment rolled in blood, will be burned as fuel for the fire. A deep awe appeared to spread over all the desolate land, and invade the very sky. Jochanan's face became lustrous, exalted, filled with a mighty light of its own, and he raised his eyes to the sky. It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be raised above the hills. All the nations shall flow to it, and many people shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, in the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall decide for many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. It was as if fire and flame had touched his cheek, and the sun his eyes. And Jacqueline came forward on the roof of the cave and lifted his hand in exultation and cried, "For unto us a child has been born, and to us a son has been given." All wept, even Joseph of Arimathea, but Saul stared up at the brilliantly illuminated figure of Jacqueline with overpowering bewilderment. For the change of tense in the latter words was astounding and incomprehensible to him. He said to himself, "It is but the rude pronunciation of the Galilean dialect, with which I am not familiar in all its nuances." Jacqueline stood, a tall image of burnished bronze against the suddenly empurpling sky, and he lifted his face, and he was lost in contemplation and prayer, and did not speak again. Joseph touched Saul's arm and said, "It's time that we go, for it will soon be dark, and the desert lurks at night with robbers." While they prepared to depart, Jacqueline still stood as if caught in timeless ecstasy, his face transfigured, and his youth stood and gazed up at him and did not move. Nor were they aware of the departing guest. At the last Saul heard them raise a tremendous shout, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." The car rolled rapidly towards Jerusalem, and the desert air became chill. Saul was silent for a time, and then he said, "I do not understand that peculiar man. I do not know whereof he speaks. He repeated the words of Isaiah. Nevertheless," Joseph said, and Saul could hardly believe that he had heard the words, "he knew of this hour in his mother's womb, like Sarah. Elizabeth was of a great age when she bore him, long after her years of fecundity. His father Zachary had been an old priest, and in the sanctum of the temple he had been told by an angel that his wife would bear a son, and he had not believed. Elizabeth was bent and wrinkled, and her hair was as white as a dove. Because he had not believed, he was stricken dumb. But it indeed came to pass that Elizabeth gave birth, and the lusty child was called Jacqueline. And when the men came to kiss the beard of Zachary, his speech was restored, and he praised God. But his words of rejoicing I cannot speak, though I know them. I implore you, Saul, do not question me. The time has not yet come." He covered his face with his hood, and the astonished Saul knew that he was weeping. But why he wept he did not know. Saul pondered with increasing incredulity on what he had heard and seen this day, and finally it appeared all a dream in a blasted desert, and Jacqueline a madman, and the cultivated Joseph of Arimathea one deluded by a wild creature of the desert, who was probably capable of casting spells and had a devil. And that is the end of chapter 16. We'll be back tomorrow with chapter 17. Thanks for listening.